She doesn't belong here. The words sliced through the murmur of champagne glasses and million-dollar conversations. Security guards moved with practiced efficiency toward the elderly woman in her faded blue dress, standing frozen before the painting that now commanded more money than she had earned in her lifetime. Her weathered hands trembled as she reached toward the canvas, not quite touching it. Those same hands had created every brushstroke decades ago, when hunger meant choosing between paint and bread. Now, surrounded by black ties and diamonds, Eleanor Miller became invisible again, just as she had been for 60 years. The auction hall gleamed with wealth, crystal chandeliers reflecting off marble floors, the air perfumed with exclusive fragrances and privilege. Collectors huddled in strategic corners, whispering numbers that could fund small nations. The painting, Woman in Amber Light, hung centrally illuminated, its estimated value announced at $8 million. The auctioneer's smile tightened as he noticed the disruption. "Please remove her," he said into his microphone, voice dripping with practiced civility, while his eyes conveyed annoyance. The room tittered with uncomfortable laughter. Someone whispered about better security screening. Another suggested she might be confused, possibly homeless. What no one noticed was the man in the corner, partially hidden by a decorative column. His eyes narrowed beneath familiar features as he observed the scene unfolding. Johnny Depp set down his auction paddle and straightened his jacket. The security guards had Eleanor by her elbows now, her dignity crumbling as they steered her toward the exit. The auctioneer cleared his throat, preparing to continue, as if nothing had happened. "Now, as I was saying, this exceptional piece represents a forgotten American treasure." His words trailed off as Depp stepped forward, the crowd parting instinctively before a face they all recognized. The story that would unfold over the next few minutes would be shared hundreds of thousands of times before morning. Eleanor's journey to this moment had begun at dawn. She had read about the auction in the newspaper, her own painting, once sold for $200 to pay for her daughter's medical bills, now headlining Sotheby's exclusive evening sale. She had spent her last savings on a bus ticket across 3 states, arriving with aching joints and a desperate hope to simply see her creation one final time. The painting had haunted her dreams for decades. The amber light she had captured falling across her daughter's face as she slept, feverish but peaceful, during that terrible winter of 1963. She had mixed the oils with tears, knowing she would have to part with it soon. The security guard's grip tightened on her arm as she tried to explain, "Please, I just want to look at it. I painted it. It's my daughter." Her voice, though soft, carried a lifetime of longing that fell on indifferent ears. "Ma'am, without credentials, I'll have to ask you to leave immediately." Eleanor's shoulders hunched forward as if bearing a physical blow. 60 years of obscurity, of painting in early mornings before factory shifts, of teaching community art classes for barely enough to cover rent, all culminating in this moment of rejection before her greatest work. The auctioneer continued his pitch, his voice amplifying her invisibility. "Note the exceptional emotion in the brushwork, clearly influenced by the American realist movement, though the artist herself remains an enigma." Johnny Depp had come to the auction almost by accident. A friend had mentioned the sale, noting a piece that might interest his collection of overlooked American art. He hadn't planned to bid, merely to observe, perhaps remember names of artists worth researching. But something in the old woman's posture, the reverence with which she approached the canvas, the familiarity in her gaze as she looked upon it, triggered his attention. Celebrity had made him sensitive to authenticity, able to distinguish the real from the performed in an instant. And everything in her body language screamed truth, while the polished auctioneer spun beautiful fictions about discovering forgotten genius. As Eleanor was being escorted toward the exit, Her soft protests drowned beneath the murmur of wealth. A transformation came over her face. Resignation replaced resistance. This was merely the final chapter in a lifetime of being overlooked. She had been invisible when galleries rejected her work in the 60s because women's domestic scenes lack market appeal. Invisible when critics praised male contemporaries who painted similar subjects. Invisible when she took night shifts cleaning office buildings to afford canvas and brushes. The bitter familiarity of this dismissal almost comforted her. At least this rejection came in a beautiful room, with her work finally recognized, even if she wasn't. The auctioneer's voice rose with practiced enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen, let us continue with lot number 37, Woman in Amber Light, the recently discovered masterpiece by E.M. Miller, depicting intimate American domesticity with extraordinary technical skill. We'll start the bidding at $3 million. Paddles began to rise around the room, the painting's value climbing in $100,000 increments. The wealthy collectors saw investment potential, status acquisition, a conversation piece for mansion walls. None saw what Eleanor saw, a desperate young mother's love crystallized in oil paint, created in the stolen hours between exhaustion and dawn. Johnny Depp watched the old woman's retreat, noting the paradoxical dignity in her surrender. Fame had taught him about power, how it flowed, how it corrupted, how it rendered some people visible and others invisible. He had experienced both states throughout his career. The contrast between the auctioneer's polished performance and the woman's raw emotion triggered something primal in him, a recognition of injustice that transcended the gilded surfaces of the room. He had witnessed too many artists exploited, their work commodified while they lived in poverty. Moving with deliberate calm, he stepped into the center aisle. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that needed no microphone. "I believe there's been a mistake." The room fell silent. Recognition rippled through the crowd, whispers of Johnny Depp spreading like wildfire. Phones appeared discreetly, recording what was quickly becoming more valuable than any painting. Authentic celebrity intervention. The auctioneer's professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing the flustered man beneath. Caught between protocol and the magnetic pull of fame, he stammered, "Mr. Depp, we're in the middle of—" "The woman you're escorting out," Depp continued, his voice carrying the weight of roles played and lives observed. "I believe she has more right to be here than most of us." He moved with unhurried confidence toward Eleanor, whose bewildered expression reflected her disbelief. The security guards hesitated, caught in the impossible position of following protocol while confronting celebrity. One of them recognized Depp from a film premiere he had worked years earlier and instinctively loosened his grip on Eleanor's arm. The other auction attendees watched with the rapt attention of audiences who had paid thousands for front-row theater seats. This unexpected drama, authentic, unpredictable, exceeded the scripted excitement of rising bids. Collectors who moments ago had been focused on acquisition calculations now found themselves witnesses to a moment no money could purchase. A woman near the back whispered to her companion, "Is this some kind of publicity stunt?" But even as she asked, she knew the answer. The raw emotion on the elderly woman's face couldn't be manufactured. Depp reached Eleanor, his hand extending toward her with a gentleness that acknowledged her fragility without diminishing her importance. "Ma'am," he said, in a voice just loud enough for nearby phones to capture, "I think you should tell us about your painting." The auctioneer's protests died on his lips as cameras focused, and social media algorithms began their invisible work. The story of what would happen next was already formatting itself for viral distribution, algorithms recognizing the perfect elements of conflict, celebrity, justice, and redemption, aligning in this marble-floored auction room where art and commerce had long ago struck their uneasy bargain. Eleanor looked up at Johnny Depp with eyes that had seen decades of disappointment. Her voice, when it finally came, carried the soft strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. I painted it in our apartment in Brooklyn, winter of '63. My daughter Sarah had pneumonia. We couldn't afford proper heat. Her weathered hand gestured toward the painting. See how the light falls across her face? That's sunlight through a frosted window, the only warmth we had some days. The room had gone completely silent, the collected wealth of nations held breathless by an old woman's simple truth. The auctioneer cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Departamento. We have authentication documents, provenance records." "Let her speak," came a voice from the crowd. Then another. "Yes, let her finish." The power in the room was shifting, invisible currents rearranging the social hierarchy. Phones recorded everything, live streaming to audiences far beyond the auction house walls. The auctioneer glanced nervously at his supervisor, who stood frozen near the exit, recognizing the potential PR disaster unfolding in real time. One wrong move could transform their exclusive event into a social media parable about callous wealth and forgotten artists. Depp placed himself beside Eleanor, his celebrity creating a protective field around her. "Please continue," he said. With a gentle hand, he guided her closer to the painting, returning her to the position from which she'd been removed minutes earlier. The security guards stepped back, uncertain of their role in this rapidly evolving scenario. Eleanor moved with newfound confidence, straightening her posture as she approached her creation. "I sold it to pay for Sarah's medicine. $200 to a gallery owner who said it showed some promise but lacked sophistication." A bitter smile crossed her face. "He told me women rarely develop the technical skill for meaningful careers in fine art. Better to focus on commercial work or teaching." She reached toward the canvas, stopping just short of touching it. "I've painted hundreds of pieces since then, but never captured anything as true as this moment. My daughter recovered. That's what mattered. But I always wondered where this painting ended up." Around the room, expressions changed. Some collectors shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the humanity behind the investment assets they traded. Others leaned forward, genuinely moved. A woman in expensive jewelry wiped discreetly at her eye. The painting itself seemed to change under Eleanor's revelation, the amber light taking on new meaning, the brushstrokes revealing the desperation and love that had guided them. What had been a recently discovered masterpiece by an enigmatic figure became something far more valuable, a mother's sacrifice rendered in oil and canvas, preserved across decades. The auctioneer had recovered his professional composure, though his eyes betrayed calculation, how to transform this disruption into advantage. "A touching story, certainly," he said, voice dripping with practiced empathy. "Perhaps this adds a fascinating dimension to the work's provenance. Shall we continue the bidding with this enhanced context?" He turned toward Eleanor with a tight smile. "We thank you for your contribution to the evening's appreciation of this fine piece." Johnny Depp's expression darkened. The auctioneer's attempt to commodify Eleanor's pain, to transform her lived experience into a selling point, struck him as particularly grotesque. He had witnessed similar alchemy in Hollywood, human suffering alchemized into entertainment, authentic emotion packaged for consumption. "I think," he said, his voice carrying that dangerous quiet that had marked his most memorable performances, "that we're missing something fundamental here." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The auction's carefully orchestrated rhythm had been irrevocably disrupted. A tall man in an expensive suit stood up. "I've already bid $4 million. While this is all very moving, some of us have other appointments this evening." Several heads nodded in agreement, the spell of Eleanor's story breaking under the weight of impatience and entitlement. "$4 million?" Eleanor whispered. the number incomprehensible to someone who had calculated her life in quarters and dollars. I could have sent Sarah to college. I could have... Her voice trailed off, decades of sacrifices suddenly illuminated in stark relief. Working 2 jobs while painting at night, teaching art to neighborhood children for pocket change, watching her own daughter give up dreams of university to work at the local diner. All while her creation, her moment of purest expression, had been gaining value in climate-controlled storage facilities and private collections, its price rising with each transaction while its creator remained in obscurity. Depp sensed the room's mood shifting, the initial sympathy cooling as the reality of interrupted business set in. He had seen this before, the momentary openness to humanity before financial concerns reasserted themselves. But he had not built a career by misreading rooms or missing moments. With perfect timing, he turned to address the assembled wealth directly. "I understand the value of time," he said, with the easy charm that had defined his public persona. "And I understand the value of art as investment. But I wonder if we might, just for a moment, consider something else." He gestured toward Eleanor. "This woman created the very thing we're all here to acquire. Shouldn't she have some say in where it ends up?" The question hung in the air, simple yet revolutionary, within the context of the auction house. A younger woman in the 3rd row, dressed in artfully casual designer clothes that signaled new tech money, leaned forward. "He's right," she said, loud enough to be heard. "This is better than just buying another trophy for the collection." Phones continued recording, algorithms detecting the rising emotional valence of the scene, pushing live streams to wider audiences. Outside the auction house, a small crowd had already begun to gather as news spread through social media channels. Johnny Depp was creating a moment of authentic disruption in the rarefied world of high-end art collecting. The auctioneer's supervisor had emerged from the shadows, whispering urgently into his subordinate's ear. The calculus had changed. The potential publicity value now competed with the evening's financial goals. Eleanor stood straighter with each passing moment, as if proximity to her painting was restoring something long lost. She gazed at the canvas, at the daughter she had captured in amber light, remembering the weight of the brush in her hand and the fear in her heart as she painted by the window, pausing every few minutes to check Sarah's fever. "There's more," she said, her voice stronger now. "Look at the bottom corner beneath the bed." She pointed, and all eyes followed. "There's a small medicine bottle. I painted the label to read hope instead of the actual medication. And the shadow on the wall?" Auction attendees leaned forward, seeing these details with new eyes. "The shadow forms angel wings behind her bed. I wasn't sure she would survive the night. I painted my prayer." A palpable emotion swept through the room. Even those most eager to continue with business as usual found themselves moved by the layers of meaning revealed by the artist herself. The painting, which minutes ago had been evaluated in terms of investment potential and status conferral, transformed before their eyes into something far more profound, a historical document of human experience, a mother's fear and love rendered permanent through artistic skill born not of privilege and training, but of necessity and raw talent. Johnny Depp watched Eleanor's transformation with quiet satisfaction. He had built a career bringing characters to life, inhabiting their truths. He recognized when someone stepped fully into their own authentic power. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard, "I think we're witnessing something extraordinary, more valuable than any auction lot." He turned to Eleanor. "How does it feel seeing your work recognized after all these years?" Eleanor's eyes never left her painting. Bittersweet. Sarah never knew what her illness inspired. She died 10 years ago, cancer. Never saw her work recognized either. She was a poet. The simplicity of her statement, devoid of self-pity or manipulation, landed with devastating impact. The collectors, used to emotional appeals being strategic and calculated, recognized the raw truth when they heard it. In a world of curated social media narratives and strategic public relations, Eleanor's unvarnished reality cut through like a blade of authenticity. The impatient bidder who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His wife leaned over, whispering something that made him frown, then nod reluctantly. The tech entrepreneur in casual designer wear stood up. "I have a suggestion," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why don't we let Ms. Miller decide what happens with her painting?" The proposal sent another ripple through the crowd, radical in this context, challenging the very foundation of how the art market functioned. The auctioneer moved to object, but his supervisor placed a restraining hand on his arm, eyes fixed on the phones recording the scene. The supervisor recognized something the auctioneer didn't. They were no longer conducting an auction. They were participating in a viral moment that would define their brand for years to come. Their response now would either cast them as villains or enlightened participants in a narrative of justice and redemption. "Perhaps," the supervisor said carefully, stepping forward, "we should hear what Mr. Depp and Ms. Miller propose." All eyes turned to Johnny Depp and Eleanor Miller, unlikely allies united by a recognition of authentic value in a room dedicated to commercial worth. The atmosphere crackled with possibility. In the world outside, the video clips were already spreading exponentially, algorithms recognizing the perfect viral components of celebrity, justice, art, and emotion. What happened next would be witnessed not by hundreds, but by millions. Johnny Depp understood theatrical timing. In his decades of performance, he had learned the power of the well-placed pause, the moment of silence that draws the audience forward in their seats. He let the tension build in the auction room, every eye fixed upon him and the elderly artist beside him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried both gentleness and absolute conviction. "I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what's happening here tonight." He gestured toward the painting. "This isn't just an asset changing hands. This is a piece of someone's soul being traded like a commodity." Eleanor's eyes remained on her creation, decades of separation dissolving, as she reconnected with her younger self, the desperate mother who had poured her fear, love, and hope into each brushstroke. "I never thought I'd see it again," she said, speaking more to herself than the room. "I remember mixing the amber color. I had so little yellow paint left. I thinned it with linseed oil, worked it for hours to get that exact shade of sunrise." Her artist's eye, still sharp despite age, examined her own technique with professional detachment. "I was better than I knew then." The auction room remained suspended in uncomfortable silence. The collectors and dealers found themselves in unfamiliar territory. The clinical transaction of fine art acquisition transformed into a human drama where the roles of right and wrong were uncomfortably clear. A woman in expensive jewelry cleared her throat. "This is all very touching, but we operate in a market economy. The painting has changed hands legally multiple times. The current seller has clear title." Several heads nodded in agreement, the brief opening toward justice narrowing as financial reality reasserted itself. Depp smiled slightly, the expression familiar to millions from characters who saw hidden truths others missed. "You're absolutely right about the legal ownership," he acknowledged, disarming the objection with agreement. "I'm not suggesting anything improper has occurred in a technical sense." His emphasis on technical hung in the air. "But perhaps we might consider something beyond the strictly legal, something more—" He paused, finding the perfect word. "Human." The tech entrepreneur who had spoken earlier stood again. "I was prepared to bid $6 million for this piece, but I'd rather put my money toward something that honors the artist as well as the art." She looked directly at Eleanor. Ms. Miller, are there other works of yours available? Have you continued painting? Eleanor's laugh held decades of bittersweet struggle. My apartment is full of canvases. No one's been interested in seeing them since the Carter administration. The simple truth of this statement, an artist of extraordinary talent creating in obscurity while her single-souled work commanded millions, crystallized the injustice in terms everyone could understand. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, the collected wealth of nations suddenly conscious of their participation in a system that had failed this woman so completely. The auctioneer's supervisor, sensing the direction of the emotional current, made a rapid calculation. Perhaps, he offered cautiously, Sotheby's could arrange a special exhibition of Ms. Miller's work. We have considerable expertise in introducing artists to the appropriate collectors. Johnny Depp's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He recognized the attempt to co-opt the moment, to transform potential disruption into commercial opportunity. That's certainly generous, he said, his tone making clear he found it anything but. Though I wonder if we're still missing the central point. He turned to Eleanor, placing himself consciously in the role of supporter rather than savior. Ms. Miller, if you could choose what happens with this painting, this specific piece that you created, what would you want? Eleanor Miller looked at her painting, then slowly surveyed the room of wealthy collectors, the auctioneer, the security guards, and finally Johnny Depp. Her lifetime of invisibility had suddenly transformed into a moment where all eyes focused on her with genuine interest. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to fear. I want people to see it, not just rich people in private homes. Sarah's story deserves to be seen. So many mothers have faced that same fear, that same choice between medicine and food or rent. She turned toward her painting, addressing it directly as if it were her long-lost child. I painted hundreds more works after this, better ones technically speaking, but none with this much heart, none with this much truth. Her weathered hand gestured toward the canvas, tracing the composition without touching it. This belongs in a public museum where young mothers can stand before it and know they're not alone in their struggles, where young artists can see that great art doesn't just come from privileged hands. Johnny Depp nodded slightly, a barely perceptible movement that nevertheless registered on every recording phone. A public museum, he repeated, letting the words settle across the room, where the value isn't measured in dollars, but in human connection. He turned to address the assembled collectors directly. Who among us would deny that purpose? Who would insist this painting hang in a private home or investment storage when it could speak to thousands who need its message? The impatient bidder from earlier shifted uncomfortably, but his expression had changed. Something in Eleanor's words had penetrated the armor of entitlement. I have children, he said unexpectedly, and grandchildren. He seemed surprised by his own vulnerability. I never considered where these works come from, the lives behind them. He glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. I withdraw my bid, with the recommendation that arrangements be made to honor the artist's wishes. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The tech entrepreneur spoke again. I'll donate $1 million to whatever museum acquires this work, specifically for an exhibition space dedicated to overlooked female artists. She looked directly at Eleanor. And I'd like first opportunity to see your other works, Ms. Miller. The auctioneer's supervisor stepped forward, recognizing both crisis and opportunity. Sotheby's would be pleased to facilitate an appropriate museum acquisition, he offered, professional training allowing him to mask his calculation behind genuine-seeming concern. We could arrange a special event to celebrate Ms. Miller's contribution to American art. Johnny Depp watched these responses with the careful attention of someone who had navigated the waters of public performance for decades. He recognized the auction house's attempt to maintain control of the narrative even as it shifted beneath them. With perfect timing, he redirected attention. "These are generous offers," he acknowledged, "but I believe there's an even more appropriate resolution." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. After a few moments of scrolling, he looked up with quiet confidence. "I've just been in contact with the director of the Whitney Museum of American Art. They've expressed immediate interest in Woman in Amber Light as part of their permanent collection of works by female American artists." A collective intake of breath swept the room. The Whitney represented legitimization at the highest level of the art world. "Furthermore," Depp continued, "they're prepared to mount a retrospective exhibition of Ms. Miller's complete works, with appropriate compensation for any pieces acquired for their permanent collection." Eleanor's hand went to her mouth, emotions finally overcoming her composure. Decades of rejection, of painting in obscurity while working multiple jobs, of being dismissed and overlooked, all suddenly reversed in a moment of public validation that exceeded anything she could have imagined. "The Whitney," she whispered, the name holding near mythic significance to someone who had been denied entry to the established art world her entire career. Sarah would have... She couldn't complete the sentence, tears finally spilling down weathered cheeks. Smartphones captured everything: the raw emotion, the power dynamics shifting in real time, the collective witnessing of justice long delayed. In the digital world beyond the auction room, the story was exploding across platforms, the algorithms recognizing authentic human drama unfolding with perfect dramatic structure. Comment sections filled with expressions of outrage, hope, and calls for similar justice for other overlooked artists. The scene had all the elements that caused humans to share content: emotional impact, status correction, moral clarity, cultural significance, and the satisfying arc of wrongs being righted through unexpected intervention. The auctioneer's supervisor struggled to maintain professional composure, recognizing that control of the situation had shifted entirely away from Sotheby's carefully orchestrated process. "While we appreciate Mr. Depp's initiative," he began, voice strained with forced politeness, "there are established protocols for museum acquisition. The current seller has contractual expectations." "I'll cover the seller's reserve price," Johnny Depp interrupted, his tone making clear he wouldn't allow procedural objections to derail Eleanor's moment, "and compensate Sotheby's for their standard commission." The room fell silent again, the simple application of wealth cutting through bureaucratic resistance. This was a language everyone present understood. "Consider it my contribution to correcting a historical oversight." He turned to Eleanor with genuine respect. "If that meets with your approval, Ms. Miller." Eleanor nodded, words temporarily beyond her capacity, as emotion overwhelmed her carefully maintained dignity. A lifetime of being dismissed and overlooked was being reversed in a single evening, in the most public way imaginable. The validation wasn't just financial. It was institutional, cultural, historical. Her work would hang in the Whitney, would be studied and appreciated, would become part of the artistic canon that had excluded her for decades. The tech entrepreneur stood again. "I'd like to maintain my pledge of $1 million to support the exhibition of Ms. Miller's work and other overlooked female artists." She looked around the room challengingly. "Anyone else care to contribute to fixing what's broken in our system?" What followed exceeded anything Eleanor could have imagined. One by one, collectors who had come to acquire art as investment vehicles or status symbols found themselves participating in something far more meaningful: the recognition and rectification of systemic injustice within their own world. Pledges of support came from around the room, some motivated by genuine revelation, others by the recognition that cameras were recording their responses for viral distribution. The cynical calculation of public relations mingled with authentic human empathy, the two becoming indistinguishable in the emotional current that had transformed the auction room. Johnny Depp watched this cascade of support with quiet satisfaction. He had lived his life in the public eye long enough to recognize the rare moments when performance and authenticity aligned perfectly, when the human need for meaningful narrative overcame the transactional nature of business as usual. Eleanor Miller stood straighter with each passing minute, decades of invisibility dissolving as she stepped fully into her rightful place as an artist worthy of recognition and respect. The supervisor, recognizing defeat, pivoted smoothly to align himself with the new direction. Sotheby's would be honored to facilitate this historic arrangement, he said, as if this had been his intention all along. We can begin making arrangements immediately for the transfer of the work to the Whitney, pending approval from all parties. He approached Eleanor with a business card. We should discuss your other works as well, Ms. Miller. There may be considerable interest. Depp stepped slightly forward, a subtle movement that nevertheless created space between Eleanor and the supervisor's opportunistic pivot. Perhaps those discussions can wait until Ms. Miller has had time to process tonight's events, he suggested, his polite tone carrying unmistakable steel, and perhaps with appropriate representation to ensure her interests are properly protected going forward. The message was clear. The days of the art world exploiting Eleanor Miller were over. Eleanor finally found her voice again, addressing the room with newfound confidence. For 60 years, I painted without recognition, without validation, often without hope. Not because I sought fame or fortune, but because I had no choice. Art was how I processed my world, my struggles, my joys. She gestured toward her painting. This piece came from the darkest time in my life, that it will now hang in a museum, that my daughter's face in amber light will be seen by generations to come. There are no words for what that means. She turned to Johnny Depp, genuine gratitude in her eyes. Thank you for seeing me when others wouldn't, for recognizing what was happening and having the courage to speak. Then she addressed the wider room, her gaze taking in the collectors, the auction staff, and the ever-present phones recording her words for audiences far beyond these walls. Art isn't just an investment. It isn't just decoration for wealthy homes. At its best, art is truth made visible, and the truth belongs to everyone. In the digital world beyond the auction room, those last words spread like wildfire across platforms. Art is truth made visible, and the truth belongs to everyone. Screenshots captured Eleanor's weathered face beside her luminous painting, Johnny Depp standing respectfully nearby, the wealth of nations transformed from consumers to witnesses. The story crystallized into the perfect viral narrative: injustice recognized, power confronted, humanity affirmed, and justice delivered through unexpected intervention. By morning, Eleanor Miller had become a household name. Video clips of the auction showdown spread across every major platform, each one gaining millions of views within hours. Morning television picked up the story, arts correspondents providing context about the systematic exclusion of female artists throughout American art history. Eleanor's journey, from desperate young mother painting by window light to overlooked genius finally receiving recognition, resonated across demographics and political divides. In a fractured media landscape, her story achieved the rare status of universal appeal, touching something fundamentally human about justice, art, and long-delayed recognition. The Whitney Museum issued an official statement confirming their acquisition of Woman in Amber Light and announcing plans for a comprehensive retrospective of Eleanor Miller's work. Art critics, who had never heard her name 24 hours earlier, scrambled to position themselves as authorities on her technique, her place in American realism, her significance as a female artist working outside institutional support systems. Overnight, Eleanor's obscurity transformed into a career-making opportunity for critics and commentators who recognized the cultural moment unfolding in real time. Johnny Depp maintained a respectful distance, careful not to overshadow Eleanor's moment with his celebrity. His only public statement came in the form of a simple social media post featuring a photograph of Eleanor standing before her painting, with the caption, "Art finds its truth teller. Eleanor Miller at the Whitney Museum, 2025, honored to witness justice." The post accumulated millions of likes within hours, the comment section filled with expressions of gratitude for his intervention and demands for similar justice for other overlooked artists. Eleanor herself experienced the strangest day of her long life. From her modest one-bedroom apartment in a forgotten corner of New Jersey, she watched in bewilderment as her phone, an outdated model gifted by a neighbor's daughter, exploded with notifications. Interview requests from major networks, messages from long-lost colleagues and students, offers of representation from the most prestigious galleries and agents in the country. The social worker who checked on her weekly arrived to find a news van parked outside the building and security personnel hired by the Whitney to ensure her privacy and safety. "I never expected any of this," Eleanor told the social worker, her hands trembling slightly as she sorted through the business cards accumulating on her kitchen table. "I just wanted to see my painting one more time before I died." She looked around her small apartment, at the canvases stacked against walls, stored under the bed, crowded into the tiny closet, a lifetime of work created without audience or acclaim. The social worker, who had listened to Eleanor speak of her art for years, without fully understanding its significance, moved carefully through the stacks of canvases. "These should be protected," she said, recognizing that what yesterday had seemed like the harmless hoarding of an elderly woman was today revealed as an undiscovered cultural treasure. "The Whitney is sending art handlers this afternoon," Eleanor replied, still processing the magnitude of the transformation occurring in her life. "They're documenting everything for the retrospective." She paused, looking out her window at the familiar view she had painted dozens of times in different lights and seasons. Sarah would have loved this. She always said someday people would understand. 3 weeks later, the Whitney Museum's main gallery hosted an unprecedented event. Eleanor Miller Unseen America opened to the largest first-day attendance in the museum's recent history. The centerpiece, displayed in a position of honor, was Woman in Amber Light, now accompanied by a detailed description of its creation, the historical context of healthcare inequality in 1960s America, and Eleanor's personal journey. Surrounding it were 60 years of Eleanor's work, curated to show her development as an artist, her exploration of technique, her unflinching documentation of working-class American life from a female perspective. Art critics from major publications struggled to explain how such a significant talent had remained undiscovered for decades. Their reviews contained equal parts praise for her work and uncomfortable self-examination of the systems that had excluded her. "Miller's obscurity indicts us all," wrote the New York Times art critic. "Her canvases reveal not just extraordinary technical skill, but a perspective systematically erased from our cultural canon, the working mother whose art emerged not from privileged study, but from desperate necessity." Eleanor walked through the exhibition in quiet amazement, leaning on a cane but standing straighter than she had in years. Johnny Depp accompanied her, respectfully maintaining a supporting presence without overshadowing her moment. Together they paused before Woman in Amber Light, now protected behind museum glass, but more alive than ever in the context of Eleanor's complete body of work. "I never thought I'd see this day," Eleanor said softly. "I stopped dreaming of recognition decades ago." Depp nodded, understanding the bittersweet nature of justice delayed. "The art world lost 60 years of your influence," he replied. "That can't be recovered, but what happens next can still matter." What happened next exceeded anyone's expectations. Museums across the country began examining their acquisition policies, with several major institutions announcing initiatives specifically focused on identifying overlooked female artists. Art schools incorporated Eleanor's story into their curricula, using it to examine systemic barriers in the industry. Galleries specializing in rediscovered artists saw unprecedented interest, as collectors who had witnessed the auction house confrontation, either in person or through viral videos, sought to align themselves with the correction of historical injustices. Three major artists publicly credited Eleanor's story with giving them courage to continue their work despite institutional rejection. A documentary filmmaker began production on invisible brushstrokes, exploring the broader pattern of female artists excluded from the canon. The Whitney announced that attendance figures for Unseen America had broken all previous records for a living American artist, with visitors often waiting hours for admission. 6 months after that fateful auction night, Eleanor Miller sat in the sunlit studio of her new apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided the natural light she had craved throughout decades of painting in whatever small spaces she could afford. At 83, she had more energy than she'd felt in years, channeling it into a new series of works exploring memory, recognition, and the strange experience of finding voice after a lifetime of silence. Her hands, though marked by age, moved with confident purpose across the canvas. Behind her, carefully preserved in archival materials, stood decades of her work that had been systematically documented by museum specialists. Each painting now carried proper provenance records, condition reports, and market valuations that transformed what had once been stacked carelessly in closets into a formally recognized contribution to American art. The financial reality of this transformation remained somewhat abstract to Eleanor, who had lived so long in economic precarity that wealth seemed more theoretical than practical. She had established a foundation in Sarah's name, dedicated to supporting single mothers pursuing artistic careers. Johnny Depp had maintained a respectful friendship, visiting occasionally but careful to ensure Eleanor's story remained her own rather than a celebrity footnote. His intervention had sparked something larger than either could have anticipated. A fundamental questioning of how value is assigned in cultural spaces, who decides which voices matter, whose experiences deserve preservation and study. The art world, notoriously resistant to change, found itself undergoing uncomfortable but necessary self-examination. The auctioneer from Sotheby's had resigned following internal investigation into long-time practices that had systematically excluded certain artists from consideration. The auction house announced new protocols for researching provenance that included identifying and appropriately compensating original creators where possible. 3 other major auction houses quickly followed suit, recognizing both the ethical imperative and the changing demands of public perception. Eleanor set down her brush, stepping back to consider her current work in progress, a large canvas depicting the moment in the auction house when everything changed. She had painted herself as she had been, small and uncertain, but with an inner light beginning to emerge. She had captured Johnny Depp not as a celebrity savior, but as a catalyst who recognized truth and chose to amplify it. Most powerfully, she had depicted the watching crowd in the moment of transformation, faces showing the complex human reality of witnessing justice unfold, discomfort, revelation, resistance, acceptance. Her phone rang, another interview request, one of dozens she received weekly. Eleanor had become selective about which she accepted, preserving her energy for painting and for mentoring young female artists who sought her guidance. Today's call came from a national morning program wanting to feature her as part of their Women Who Changed America series. Eleanor smiled at the irony. She had been exactly the same person, creating the same art, for 60 years. What had changed wasn't her, but the world's willingness to see her. As she considered whether to accept the interview, Eleanor turned to the small photograph on her easel. Sarah at 20, long before cancer would take her, smiling with the unguarded joy of youth. "We did it, my girl," Eleanor whispered. "They see us now." She touched the photograph gently before turning back to her canvas, adding a subtle highlight to capture the amber light that had started everything. The same warm glow that had fallen across her daughter's fevered face 6 decades earlier, transformed through art into something permanent, universal, and finally irrefutably visible. In museums, universities, and studios across America, conversations about Eleanor Miller continued to transform understanding of art's purpose, value, and meaning. The story of the auction house confrontation remained in active cultural circulation, referenced in discussions of artistic justice, institutional accessibility, and the power of individual intervention against systemic exclusion. What had begun as one woman's desperate attempt to glimpse her long-lost painting evolved into a fundamental reassessment of whose stories deserve preservation, whose visions merit witness, and whose truths belong in our cultural memory. Eleanor's most famous statement, "Art is truth made visible, and the truth belongs to everyone," appeared on museum walls, classroom posters, and social media profiles, a simple declaration that challenged centuries of exclusionary practice. In its viral journey across digital platforms, this statement reached audiences far beyond traditional art consumers, resonating with anyone who had ever felt their truth dismissed or devalued. The elderly artist, who had spent decades in obscurity, now found herself an unlikely icon of perseverance, authenticity, and the enduring power of creation in the face of indifference. And in the Whitney Museum, Woman in Amber Light hung in permanent display, gathering new admirers daily. Visitors often stood before it for extended periods, moved not just by the technical skill and emotional power of the painting itself, but by the story of its journey, from a desperate mother's moment of fear and love to a cultural touchstone of belated recognition. The amber light Eleanor had captured continued to glow across decades, illuminating not just her daughter's face, but the long shadow of systematic erasure and the transformative power of finally truly being seen.